Millionaire forced his stepson to get engaged to a waitress to humiliate him. The scandalous headline crawled through the small community of Willow Creek like a wildfire, igniting rumors and speculation in every diner booth and on every suburban front porch. In this quiet corner of the United States, where picket fences and modest Main Street shops hinted at traditional values, no one could resist the juicy gossip of how a wealthy man named Grant Thurmond had orchestrated a bizarre engagement for his young stepson Carter Thurmond to a local waitress, all for the sake of pride and revenge. The entire affair seemed impossible to believe. Yet, as the story spread, it left behind a mix of awe and disapproval, testament to the power and arrogance that wealth could bring. Neighbors who remembered Carter as a polite, if somewhat aloof, teenager were left grappling with the question of why his own stepfather would go to such lengths to publicly embarrass him. And beneath that surface question hovered a deeper uncertainty. What could possibly happen next? The Thurmonds were a household name in Willow Creek, not because the family actively sought fame or a high-profile social life, but because Grant Thurmond was a major investor in local real estate. He had swooped into the county decades ago with a keen business mind and an uncanny ability to turn dusty properties into gleaming commercial successes. Half the town had him to thank for the blossoming retail district that attracted visitors from across the state, and local government officials credited him for boosting the economy. Despite his success, Grant had never been universally loved. Something about the way he carried himself had always held a little too high. A veneer of politeness that often came off as cold made people suspect there was a chasm between his public persona and the man he truly was behind closed doors. That suspicion thrived on small incidents. A fired contractor muttering about being cheated out of final payment, a local politician hinting at manipulative power plays, or a personal assistant quitting abruptly with a haunted look. Those details, easily dismissed one at a time, came together like puzzle pieces for anyone curious enough to see them in sum. Carter, in contrast, had grown up mostly quietly, raised initially by a loving mother named Valerie, who passed away when he was 10. He then spent his adolescence in the spacious Thurmond mansion that presided over a verdant cul-de-sac in Willow Creek's wealthiest neighborhood. Grant married Carter's mother for reasons few dared to question: love or convenience. The marriage had combined moderate wealth from Valerie's family with Grant's climbing fortune, forming what many believed to be a strategic union. After Valerie's unexpected death, Grant became Carter's guardian. At first, townspeople believed that he treated the boy well enough, providing him a top-notch education and private tutors in math, music, even foreign languages. But Carter was neither rebellious nor entirely docile. He kept to himself, displayed sparks of defiance in small ways, and formed few genuine friendships at the exclusive prep school he attended. Rumors about friction between him and his stepfather surfaced now and then, fueled by the boy's withdrawn demeanor. Over time, Carter's polite smiles at local gatherings failed to hide a mounting tension in his eyes. By the time Carter reached his early 20s, he was tall, angular, and notably soft-spoken. Instead of staying in college far from home as many had expected, he returned to Willow Creek during his sophomore year under cloudy circumstances. Some speculated that he'd been caught in some scandal or that Grant had forced him to return to handle family business. Whatever the cause, his presence in town was quiet and subdued, as if he was drifting through life without a clear anchor. Few suspected that behind closed doors, Carter was grappling with a tyrant of a stepfather, a man who orchestrated nearly every aspect of his existence. Yet the full brunt of that tyranny surfaced spectacularly with the news that the millionaire forced his stepson to get engaged to a waitress to humiliate him. And the waitress in question was none other than Samantha Porter, commonly known as Sam, a young woman with no illusions about the upper crust and no interest in being anyone's pawn. Willow Creek had its share of restaurants, but Sam worked at the Rustic Oak Diner, a homely place known for large, hearty breakfasts and bottomless coffee. She was 21, studying at a community college part-time and balancing school with long hours at the diner. Her daily routine involved 3 bus transfers, a few scuffed pairs of non-slip shoes, and the relentless chore of memorizing countless orders. Some nights, she would collapse onto her small cot in the basement of her best friend's home, exhausted but still determined to push forward. If someone had told her that she would end up fake engaged to Carter Thurmond, the stepson of the wealthiest man in town, she would have laughed outright. Yet there it was, a surreal arrangement that she suspected had strings attached, strings that threatened to manipulate not just Carter, but her own life as well. The spark that set everything in motion was a seemingly insignificant event. One early evening, Carter dropped by the rustic oak diner. He had done so a few times before, always alone, always thoughtful and polite. Sam, the only server on shift that afternoon, recognized him by sight. She also understood he was important in Willow Creek, though she didn't know the specifics. When Carter asked for an empty booth in the back, she noticed how weary he looked. She served him coffee, bacon, and eggs, and asked if there was anything else he needed. He merely shrugged and looked away, as though even that small kindness weighed heavily on him. She walked off, telling him to holler if he changed his mind. After finishing his meal, Carter lingered, sipping the last of the coffee. Without warning, he stood up, settled the check, and left with a subdued nod of thanks. Only when she cleared the table did Sam notice he'd left an unusually large tip. That, in itself, might not have been remarkable if not for the fact that the next day, Carter appeared again. This time, he pulled Sam aside hesitantly, stumbling through an apology for any awkwardness. He tried to explain that he was struggling with some complicated personal matters, but before he could say more, his phone rang. A single glance at the screen made his face go pale. He excused himself and darted outside, leaving Sam puzzled and faintly concerned. When he returned, his demeanor had changed. Something about him seemed resigned, as if a weight had dropped firmly on his shoulders. He thanked her again for her service, left another large tip, and departed quickly without finishing his meal. By the end of that week, Sam's curiosity was piqued. Willow Creek was a small town. It was hard to avoid hearing talk about the Thurmands' big estate and the stepfather who seemed to control Carter's comings and goings. A co-worker mentioned seeing Carter's car parked at the diner every night, even when Sam wasn't on shift. Apparently, he'd take a corner booth, order minimal food, and sit there for hours, sometimes typing on his laptop, other times reading thick textbooks or documents. The staff couldn't figure out why a young man with that much money would spend so much time in a modest diner. The question gnawed at Sam. Something wasn't right. It was a stormy Sunday afternoon when Sam discovered exactly what Carter was working on. The wind pounded the diner's windows, and business was slow. Carter was the only customer left. After mopping up the floor and straightening the chairs, Sam approached him. She had decided that the next time she had a slow moment, she would ask him outright what was going on. Gathering her courage, she gently tapped the side of his booth. She knew from experience, watching the interactions of her classmates, her neighbors, and even her own chaotic family, that sometimes a little directness was necessary. He looked up, startled, then carefully closed the laptop as though he didn't want her to see the contents. "Is there something I can do for you?" he asked softly. His voice was cautious, edged with tension. She shifted from foot to foot. "I couldn't help but notice you come in here a lot, and you always look—" Her voice trailed off, unsure how to put it kindly. "Stressed," she settled on, forcing a small smile. "I'm not trying to pry. It's just, I'm around if you want to talk." He took a breath, his gaze sweeping across the deserted diner. Outside, rain slanted against the windows, carrying leaves across the parking lot. "You don't want to get involved," he said after a moment. "My life isn't simple." She laughed slightly, surprising him. "I don't think anyone's life is simple. Look, I get it, you don't know me. But I see you here every day, and you're obviously dealing with something." Carter studied her face, sincere, a little stubborn. He glanced at his laptop and exhaled. "I'm planning to leave Willow Creek," he admitted, each word spoken as if it cost him a piece of his soul. "I'm looking for a job, an apartment in another state, something I can do to break away from my stepfather." Sam's eyebrows lifted in silent question. "That bad, huh?" He nodded slowly. "Worse than you can imagine." And if the conversation had ended there, if Carter had managed to slip out that door for good, maybe the entire fiasco could have been avoided. But that same night, in a coincidence that felt almost designed, Grant Thurman decided to grace the rustic oak diner with his presence. The older man arrived in a sleek black car, stepping inside with an air of authority that immediately set Sam on edge. She recognized him from local newspaper photos and the occasional glimpses at charity galas on the local news. He was tall, with immaculate salt and pepper hair and a proud carriage. His hands were ungloved, revealing a large signet ring, and his polished shoes squeaked on the linoleum floor as he surveyed the modest surroundings. He caught sight of Carter in the far booth, and Sam noticed a cold flicker of satisfaction spark in his eyes. She sensed danger in that expression, like a predator that had finally cornered its prey. Grant approached the booth with measured steps, ignoring Sam entirely. "Carter," he said in a clipped tone, "I had a feeling I'd find you here." Turning his gaze on the young woman, he offered a perfunctory nod, then gave Carter a look that quietly demanded an introduction. Carter stood up, nearly knocking his coffee mug over. "Grant, this is Sam," he mumbled, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. "Sam, my stepfather, Grant Thurman." Grant held out his hand politely. His grip was cold and firm when Sam shook it, and she had to suppress a shiver. "A pleasure," he said, though his tone indicated anything but. Then he angled his body, forcing Sam to step back. "Carter, we need to talk. Now." Sam took that as her cue. She backed off, busying herself with tidying another table. A hush fell over the diner as the storm outside battered the windows, underscoring the tension in that corner booth. She couldn't catch every word, but Grant's low, forceful voice contrasted starkly with Carter's halting, barely audible replies. Phrases like, "You owe me," "This is non-negotiable," and "You think you can run away from your obligations," drifted to her ears. She spotted Carter burying his face in his hands at one point, while Grant leaned over the table, brow furrowed, pressing his advantage. The exchange ended with Carter's shoulders slumped in defeat. Then Grant rose, paid the bill for both men in crisp cash, and paused only to glance at Sam with what felt like a calculated smile. After they left, Sam discovered a trail of tension coiling in her own stomach. She sensed that something was starting to shift in Carter's life, and quite possibly in hers as well. This was not just a spat between family members, it had the makings of a crisis with far-reaching consequences. Within 3 days, the talk around Willow Creek was that Carter Thurman had abruptly ended his online apartment hunts and job searches. People who had seen him in the diner no longer spotted him at night. Rumors surfaced that Grant had a new plan to toughen up his stepson. Some guessed he wanted Carter to manage a new local business. Others suggested Carter was going to be forced back to college for a degree beneficial to the Thurman empire. But no one accurately predicted the actual scheme. The moment the entire town heard that the millionaire forced his stepson to get engaged to a waitress to humiliate him, it raised eyebrows to the point that local news outlets tried, unsuccessfully, to get official statements from the family. Carter was locked away in the mansion, unreachable to friends and acquaintances. Sam, meanwhile, found herself at the epicenter of a scandal she neither wanted nor understood. She got the news from Carter himself, who appeared at the diner at closing time, sweat beading his brow, eyes wide with desperation. Sam had just taken off her apron and was about to head home when he practically sprinted through the door. "We need to talk privately," he gasped, ignoring the startled glance from the cook in the back. Sam led him to an empty table, away from prying ears. He inhaled deeply. "My stepfather expects me to... He wants..." He trailed off, struggling to form the sentence. Then, in a voice filled with dread, "He wants me to get engaged to you." Sam blinked, sure she had misheard. "Excuse me?" Carter raked a hand through his hair. "Grant's made it clear this is some twisted power play. He wants to show the world that he can marry me off to someone he deems beneath the Thurman status to prove a point. I told him it's insane, but he threatened me with, he can cut me off, Sam. He can do worse. He's got legal ties to my mum's estate, and if I don't comply, he'll bury me in lawsuits, freeze every account, throw me out with nothing. And it's not just about money. He has ways of making sure I'll never get a decent job anywhere. He can blackball me from every industry with a few calls." Words failed Sam. She was not naive about class differences or the manipulations of the wealthy, but this sounded like a step beyond reason. "And he picked me because—" Carter's eyes flickered with shame. "He's seen me talking to you. When he found me here, we were chatting. I guess he thinks you're the perfect representation of someone he considers low class. He wants to degrade me by tying me to a mere diner waitress. He said it would be a lesson in humility for me, that I'd regret trying to act out of line. And for you, maybe he thinks you won't resist. He said he'd make sure you benefit financially." Sam's first instinct was to storm over to the Thurman mansion and give Grant a piece of her mind, but she reeled at the enormity of it all. There was a reason that arrogant man could do such brazen things: money, power, and an entire web of influence. "He can't actually force you to marry me. Engagement is just words, right?" she asked, voice trembling between anger and disbelief. Carter shook his head. "You don't know him. He'll make life miserable for us if we resist. He made it clear, if I don't announce our engagement, he'll bulldoze the diner or buy it out or do whatever it takes to ruin you. It's not about love or even marriage. It's about his control. And we'll have to pretend it's real long enough to satisfy him, until he decides he's done humiliating me." She stared at him, her heart pounding. "This is insane. I know, but I also know he's serious." Sam pinched the bridge of her nose, trying to think. She had never felt so cornered. It wasn't that she believed Grant's scheme would last forever. Obviously, a forced engagement could be ended, but in the meantime, the consequences for defying him could be catastrophic. "So what do we do?" she asked softly, suddenly aware of how close to tears she was. A despairing laugh escaped Carter. "We either play along or pay dearly." The next 2 weeks were a whirlwind. Grant wasted no time, ensuring that the local grapevine buzzed with news of the happy couple. Photos were arranged in a rushed manner, presumably for social media or newspaper announcements, that framed the engagement as a spontaneous romance. Sam tried to protest, only to find that her boss at the diner, who had a pending lease renewal on the building, pleaded with her to cooperate. He hinted that if she didn't, the landlord, one of Grant's associates, would refuse to extend the lease, effectively shutting down the rustic oak diner and costing everyone their jobs. The noose was tight on every side. Sam began to understand just how thoroughly Grant Thurman controlled Willow Creek's fate. A hollow, surreal routine developed. Sam would put on a polite smile at events, slip into conservative dresses that Grant's personal shopper had delivered, and hold Carter's hand in front of acquaintances who toasted their impending nuptials. Carter, for his part, tried to maintain some dignity by insisting on a few boundaries, like keeping the press out of their private interactions. But every day, new humiliations were inflicted upon him. Grant would gather business associates at the mansion for lavish dinners, then casually introduce Sam as the future Mrs. Thurman, with a smug grin that radiated condescension. At these gatherings, Sam overheard snickers from wealthy guests. Some openly questioned Carter's choice, not realizing it wasn't really his choice at all. Others made vague remarks about the charity case, meaning Sam, and joked about whether she knew which fork to use for the salad. Behind the scenes, Sam struggled to cope with the emotional turmoil. She had done nothing wrong, yet she was thrust into the role of gold digger, a tool in Grant's plan to humiliate Carter. She oscillated between fury at the manipulation and guilt for being part of Carter's misery. Still, a flicker of empathy united the unlikely pair. They recognized each other as victims of a ruthless man's strategy. In odd moments of respite, like when they walked in the manicured Thurmond estate gardens to discuss how they might eventually break free, they shared painful truths. Carter admitted he had never felt truly accepted by Grant, had never even been wanted as a son. He suspected the only reason Grant kept him around was because Carter's late mother, Valerie, had set certain legal conditions ensuring Carter received a portion of the family's assets at 25. If Carter left too soon, that portion might threaten the fortress Grant had built. By forging this humiliating engagement, Grant was trying to keep Carter under his thumb, ensuring that the boy's independence or rebellious streak would never bloom. Sam, in turn, revealed her own vulnerabilities, her single mother's poor health, her father's absence, and her fear that if she lost her job at the diner or was blacklisted around town, she would have nothing to fall back on. She also confided a secret dream, to open her own bakery someday, to serve the pastries she tested in her tiny kitchen on weekends. Carter listened with genuine interest, even encouraging her that it was possible if they both found a way out of Grant's labyrinth. One day, about a month after the forced engagement had become public knowledge, Sam was startled to discover that a small business loan had been pre-approved for her at a local bank. The bank manager called her personally to inform her, his voice dripping with surprise at her sudden good fortune. "I don't know who you know in high places," he joked, "but apparently you're quite the catch, Miss Porter." Sam's stomach flipped in dread, understanding that this was Grant's handiwork. He was dangling her dream in front of her, hoping to cement her involvement. If she took that money, she would be beholden to him. The realization made her feel more trapped than ever. Carter's internal storm only grew worse with each passing event. Grant orchestrated a large engagement party at a country club just outside town. The invitation list included local politicians, business leaders, social elites, and a few of Carter's classmates from prep school. Sam dreaded it, but she realized this was an opportunity to gather more information. Maybe, just maybe, she could find a thread to pull that would unravel Grant's manipulations. She dressed in a tasteful navy blue dress, her hair pinned up by a professional stylist Grant had hired, while Carter wore a dark suit that emphasized the tired slump of his shoulders. They arrived in Carter's car, an expensive sedan provided by the estate, and tried to stand tall as cameras flashed. Inside the opulent ballroom, waiters in crisp uniforms served champagne and hors d'oeuvres to the well-dressed crowd. A jazz quartet played softly by the stage. Underneath the glittering chandeliers, Sam felt wholly out of place. She moved through the room with Carter, meeting his old prep school friends who struggled to mask their shock at his choice of fiancée. One, a blonde woman named Veronica, took Sam aside and said, "I'm sure you're very sweet, dear, but Carter always said he'd rather climb the corporate ladder than settle down. This is so fast. Are you sure everything's okay?" The question was loaded with skepticism, and Sam forced a polite laugh, feeling the weight of the secret tug at her. Meanwhile, Carter found himself cornered by a group of Grant's associates, men in sharply tailored suits who chuckled about how refreshing it was to see the youngest Thurmond dabbling among the commoners. Carter clenched his jaw, resisting the urge to lash out. He felt like an animal on display, a spectacle for the affluent audience. Nearby, Grant glided from one conversation to the next, toasting with champagne and throwing smirks at his stepson. The entire affair reeked of superiority and arrogance. In a quieter corridor near the restrooms, Sam stumbled upon an unexpected sight. Grant Thurmond, talking on his phone in hushed but intense tones. She paused near the corner, out of sight, her heart skipping a beat at the possibility of overhearing something useful. What she caught were fragments of conversation that piqued her interest, mentions of an upcoming lawsuit, references to property rights, and Carter's name sprinkled throughout. Then Grant said something chilling. "No, I can't let him gain access to the trust. If he does, my entire leverage collapses. That's why I'm orchestrating this fiasco. By the time Carter realizes he's stuck, it'll be too late. He'll sign the documents, and I'll have everything locked down. Sam's stomach twisted. So this engagement was about more than just humiliation. It was about inheritance and legal control. She heard Grant give a curt laugh before ending the call. Fear gripped her, but so did determination. She slipped away unnoticed, her mind racing with the question of how to use this information. That evening, after the party, Sam pretended she had a headache and asked Carter to drive her home. Once they were alone in the car, she told him what she had overheard. He paled, his fingers tightening around the steering wheel. "So it's about the trust," he murmured. "I knew my mother's estate set something up for me, but I never got the details. She died when I was so young, and all the paperwork was handled by Grant. I only know it releases funds and possibly property rights on my 25th birthday. That's less than 2 years away now." Sam pressed. "He mentioned you signing documents that would prevent you from accessing it. Or maybe letting him manage it. Is that something you can refuse to do?" Carter's frustration was palpable. "If I refuse, he can ruin both of us. But maybe, I don't know. If I can find the original trust documents or talk to the lawyer who handled them, I might have leverage." His eyes flickered with a glimmer of hope. "If I prove that Grant's controlling me illegally, maybe I can break away. We could end this engagement and keep the diner safe." A plan began to form, though it was tenuous. They needed to locate the original lawyer or the trust papers. Sam suspected that somewhere in the Thurman mansion, locked in an office or vault, lay the key to Carter's freedom. Gaining access was another matter. The estate was large, with a security system and staff loyal to Grant. Carter had free rein to move within the house, but rummaging through locked drawers without raising suspicion would be tricky. Nonetheless, they decided to try. For weeks, Carter discreetly searched the mansion. He focused on Grant's private study, an imposing room lined with legal tomes and expensive artwork. At first, he found nothing but innocuous files about real estate deals, local partnerships, and philanthropic ventures. But late one night, while Grant was out of town, Carter discovered a hidden compartment in the massive walnut desk. Inside lay a folder labeled with a date matching Carter's mother's death certificate and a handful of references to the Thurman Trust. He photographed the documents with his phone, careful not to rearrange anything. Then he locked everything back in place. When he showed the photos to Sam the following day, they realized the language was dense with legal jargon. But from what they could parse, the trust mandated that Carter inherit not just a substantial sum of money, but also controlling interest in some of Grant's core businesses, shares that his mother had originally owned. That was the real danger for Grant. If Carter had controlling shares, Grant's authority in the boardroom would be diminished. More importantly, the trust had a condition. Carter must be unmarried and free of spousal ties at the time the assets transferred. If Carter was married, or even legally bound for marriage in a way that invoked certain prenuptial agreements, the trust structure gave Grant a legal angle to claim partial or total control. In short, if Carter was engaged or married to Sam, and if the right documents were signed, it could funnel the assets away from Carter and into Grant's holdings. That explained why the older man was so eager for this humiliating engagement. He wanted Carter to sign a prenuptial agreement that would effectively relinquish his rights. The arrangement was brilliant in its cruelty. Carter would be too mortified to fight back, and Sam would be too intimidated by the threat to her own livelihood to question the details. Armed with this revelation, Sam and Carter realized they had a small window of opportunity. If they could make it to Carter's 25th birthday without signing away his rights and without letting Grant sabotage them, they could claim the trust assets fully. After that, it wouldn't matter if they broke off the engagement. Grant's leverage would vanish. Yet they faced nearly 2 years of subterfuge, all while pretending to be an engaged couple. The thought was daunting. They needed a better solution, something more immediate. The next move came unexpectedly. One of Carter's childhood friends from the prep school, a man named Daniel Pierce, reached out to Sam with a cryptic message. "I may be able to help. Meet me at Willow Creek Park, near the lake. at noon on Saturday. Sam wasn't sure whether to trust him, but Carter vouched for Daniel, recalling that the two had shared confidences in their teenage years. So Sam agreed to the meeting. Daniel was waiting on a bench overlooking the water, wearing casual clothes and a baseball cap. He greeted Sam with a cautious smile. "You probably don't remember me," he began, hands in his pockets. "But I remember you from the diner. I used to come in with Carter sometimes back in high school breaks. Look, I know there's a lot going on. Carter doesn't answer my calls. I'm worried about him." Sam studied Daniel, searching for signs of duplicity. He seemed sincere. Quietly, she explained the forced engagement situation, leaving out the most sensitive details about the trust. Daniel looked genuinely horrified. "That's beyond anything I imagined," he said, raking a hand over his face. "I knew Grant was manipulative, but not to this extent." "Why did you want to meet?" Sam asked. Daniel exhaled. "Because I want to help Carter. My father's a lawyer, specializing in estate law. If you show him the trust documents, he might find a loophole or file an injunction before Grant can do more damage. But we need the original documents, not just phone photos, to mount a solid legal case. If Carter can prove undue influence or coercion, a judge might freeze the trust, preventing Grant from rewriting or interfering with it." The possibility made Sam's heart pound with cautious excitement. "So if we get you the original documents, your father can help Carter keep control?" Daniel nodded. "I can't promise success, but we can try. This is probably the only chance Carter has to stand up to Grant legally." Sam thanked him, and they parted ways. That night, she relayed Daniel's offer to Carter. He was torn. Retrieving the original documents from Grant's study was risky. Getting caught would unleash the full wrath of the man. But the alternative, continuing the sham engagement under constant threat, seemed worse. They agreed on a plan. Grant was hosting a grand charity fundraiser in a neighboring city in a week's time, an event that would take him out of the mansion for at least half a day. That would be their window. Carter would feign illness to avoid attending, while Sam would conveniently step out for errands, giving them the chance to meet at the estate when the staff was otherwise engaged. The day arrived with an almost cinematic tension. Sam was at the mansion under the pretext of discussing wedding arrangements with Carter, though in truth she was there to keep watch for any staff who might wander near Grant's study. Carter headed to the locked desk compartment, heart pounding in his chest. He used a spare key he had found hidden in Grant's bedroom, slid open the drawer, and quickly extracted the folder. That was when he noticed something new. Fresh documents were tucked inside, presumably the prenuptial agreement. Carter's stomach churned. He stuffed everything into a satchel and crept out of the study. They left the estate in Carter's car, heading to a prearranged location, the parking lot behind an abandoned strip mall. There, Daniel waited with his father, Richard Pierce, who wore a suit despite the seedy surroundings. Carter handed over the folder, explaining the significance of each document. Richard's expression grew grim as he read. "This is definitely a case of undue influence," he said finally. "If we can prove Carter never intended to sign the prenup, a court would see that he's being coerced. The challenge is the timing. Grant may try to countersue or claim that Carter's incompetent, but if I file a petition in a higher court for an injunction, we might gain a temporary shield. Carter, you're an adult and a rightful beneficiary of your mother's trust. Grant's position isn't as secure as he thinks." Relief coursed through Carter, but it was tempered by the knowledge that Grant would retaliate. Richard told them to lie low while he prepared the paperwork. "Whatever you do, don't tip off Grant that you have the original folder," he warned. "We'll need about a week to get everything in place. Once we file the petition, the documents will be on public record, and it's game on." They agreed to maintain normal appearances until the legal proceeding was underway. But that night, as Carter drove Sam back from the clandestine meeting, they spotted a black SUV tailing them. Panic flared. Carter made a sudden turn onto a side street, hoping to lose the vehicle. It followed, headlights burning. Sam clutched the car door, her heart pounding. Eventually, Carter managed to slip away through a winding network of residential roads. Shaken, they realized Grant might already suspect something. This chase was a warning. The older man had eyes everywhere. Sure enough, the next morning, Grant summoned Carter to the dining room, where an elaborate breakfast was laid out. Usually they barely ate together. Grant always had an early meeting or was otherwise engaged, but that day he insisted. Sam was also invited. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken accusations. Grant sipped his coffee slowly, watching them both with an almost feline amusement. "You two have been busy, haven't you?" he said, finally breaking the silence. "I've seen you sneaking around, whispering in corners. Care to share what you've been up to?" Carter forced a laugh. "We're just planning wedding details." "You wanted a grand event, remember?" Grant raised an eyebrow. "Indeed. However, it appears that your brand of planning involves rummaging through my study, perhaps searching for certain legal documents. Don't bother lying. I know you took something from my desk yesterday." Sam's pulse thundered, but she tried to keep her expression neutral. Carter spoke with forced calm. "You're paranoid. Besides, if I need any documents, it's likely because I have a right to them." Grant's jaw tightened, but he managed a thin smile. "You're right. Let me remind you, Carter, that everything under this roof is mine. That includes the directions of your life. As long as you depend on me, you might want to think very carefully about your next moves. I won't take kindly to betrayal." He set his cup down with a loud clang. Then he turned to Sam. "And you, Miss Porter, I've been exceedingly generous. Money, a potential business loan, a secure future. Don't make the mistake of biting the hand that feeds you. You wouldn't want your precious diner or your new financial opportunities to vanish overnight." Sam refused to be cowed. "Generous?" she echoed in disbelief. "Forgive me for not expressing my gratitude, for having my life manipulated." Grant shrugged. "Spare me the moral posturing. You two have until the end of this month to finalize the engagement paperwork or face the consequences. I've already arranged a date with the local magistrate for the official license. If you fail to show up, well, I think you know what happens next." With that ominous statement, Grant rose from the table and swept out of the room, leaving behind a tension that felt like shards of glass in the air. Panicking, Carter called Daniel, who in turn told them that Richard Pierce was fast-tracking the legal filing. "We just need a couple more days," Daniel said. "Then it won't matter what Grant threatens. The court order will at least buy you some time. Stay safe until then." 2 days later, an emergency motion was filed at the county courthouse under seal. The next step was to serve Grant with legal papers, which would force him to appear in court for a hearing on Carter's claim of undue influence. If the judge agreed, Carter would be protected from signing any documents that compromised his inheritance. Grant would be barred from forcing Carter's hand in marriage or tying it to the trust. In a best-case scenario, the judge might even freeze certain assets under dispute, weakening Grant's financial stronghold. But Grant was not one to be caught off guard. The evening before the hearing, Sam received a frantic text from her mother's caretaker. Her mother had collapsed and was rushed to the hospital in critical condition. Sam nearly dropped her phone in alarm. Without hesitation, she told Carter she had to leave immediately. He insisted on driving her. As they sped toward the hospital, dread churned in Sam's stomach. She had seen her mother's health decline over the years, but this sudden emergency felt like a cruel twist. When they arrived, the caretaker explained that the older woman had complained of dizziness all day, then fainted. Doctors were still running tests. Sam was relieved at least that her mother was stable for the moment. While Sam waited in the corridor, Carter stepped outside to call Daniel about the court hearing. A few minutes later, Sam noticed a man in a dark suit approach. He introduced himself as an associate of Grant Thurmond, handing her a business card with a name she didn't recognize. "Mr. Thurmond would like you to know that your mother's medical bills can be paid in full," he said coolly, "provided you convince Carter to sign the prenuptial agreement immediately. It's in your best interest, Miss Porter. Health insurance can be difficult when resources are lacking." Fury and fear welled up simultaneously. "That's blackmail," she hissed, looking around to see if anyone was listening. The man shrugged. "It's a generous offer, far more than you deserve. Should you fail to comply, you might find the hospital less accommodating. Of course, you're free to decide." With that, he left. Sam sat there, trembling, thinking about how she couldn't afford a prolonged hospital stay for her mother. The caretaker had done her best, but the finances were precarious. Grant was hitting her at her most vulnerable point. By the time Carter returned, Sam was nearly in tears. She told him about the threat, and he looked stricken. "I'll figure out a way to pay," he said, though Sam knew he currently had no control over family funds. "Don't sign anything. Tomorrow we go to court." Morning arrived, and Sam's mother stabilized enough for Sam to step away. She and Carter made their way to the courthouse, hearts pounding. Daniel and Richard met them at the entrance, carrying a folder of evidence, including the trust documents. A hearing was scheduled in a small, wood-paneled room in front of a judge known for impartial decisions. Sam's hopes soared, but Grant was nowhere to be seen as the proceedings began. Richard presented the case for undue influence, describing how Carter was threatened with financial ruin, coerced into an engagement, and spied upon. The judge listened carefully. When asked if the respondent, Grant Thurmond, was present, an opposing attorney stood up and declared, "Mr. Thurmond regrets he cannot attend in person. He has pressing business matters out of state." The attorney argued that Carter's claims were exaggerated, painting him as an ungrateful son, trying to smear a reputable philanthropist. Richard countered with Carter's testimony and the original trust documents. Tension hung in the air as the judge examined each piece of evidence. Finally, after a long silence, the judge stated she needed time to review everything thoroughly. She scheduled a follow-up hearing in 1 week. In the interim, she granted a temporary restraining order blocking any new financial arrangements tied to Carter's name. That meant Grant couldn't force Carter to sign a prenuptial agreement or do anything else that might compromise his inheritance. It was a partial victory. Sam saw the relief flood Carter's face. They had bought time. That night, as Carter returned to the mansion, he found Grant waiting in the foyer like a thundercloud. "You ungrateful brat," Grant snapped, face pale with anger. "You dare challenge me in court? Drag my name through the mud with false accusations?" Carter stood firm. "They're not false, and you know it. I have the documents and I'm protected by the court order. You can't force me to sign anything now." Grant's lips curled. "We'll see about that. You think you've won? I'm a step ahead of you, Carter. I always am." He tossed an envelope onto the marble floor. "Open it," he commanded. Carter picked it up, tearing the seal. Inside was a series of photographs of Sam's mother in the hospital with private medical records attached. A cold sweat broke out on Carter's neck as he realized how easily Grant had invaded Sam's privacy. Then he saw the final page, an estimate for the medical bills, an astronomically high sum. Next to it, a red stamp said, "Covered by Thurmond Corporation." Carter's gaze flew to Grant, who gave him a smug grin. "I already paid them in full, so your little fiancée owes me a debt, doesn't she? Debt that you'll pay one way or another." Carter tried to mask his horror. If Sam discovered that Grant had gone behind her back to pay for everything, she would feel obligated, and her mother's well-being would hang in the balance. The entire scheme was monstrous. But Carter also realized something crucial. The restraining order might not stop Grant from applying pressure in countless personal ways. This was no longer just a legal battle. It was psychological warfare. Carter backed away, crumpling the papers in his fist. Grant's laughter echoed in the grand foyer as Carter retreated upstairs, feeling the walls close in around him. The next few days brought an uneasy stalemate. Sam's mother recovered enough to be discharged, her bills mysteriously handled. Sam suspected Grant was behind it, but Carter couldn't bring himself to confirm it outright, fearing it would only deepen her distress. Meanwhile, Daniel and Richard prepared for the second court hearing, gathering more witnesses to testify that Carter was under coercion. They lined up acquaintances who had seen Grant's manipulative tactics, as well as some of the staff from the diner who had overheard Grant's threats about shutting it down. Then, an unexpected figure entered the fray, an elderly woman named Loretta Bell, who had once been Grant's executive assistant years before retiring. Through a mutual contact, she reached out to Carter, claiming she had vital information. They met in a quiet corner of the Willow Creek Library. Loretta revealed that she had suspected for years that Grant was tampering with Valerie's estate documents. At the time, she had tried to keep a copy of the original trust, but had never been able to confirm its authenticity. "I was threatened," she confessed, her voice trembling. "Grant said he'd destroy my career, my family, if I dared go to the authorities, but I can't keep this secret anymore." She handed Carter a manila envelope. Inside were dated memos, old letters from Valerie to her attorney, and a partial trust draft that included additional clauses, such as the intention that Carter should live freely without paternal interference once he turned 18. Some of the notes implied that Valerie might have suspected Grant's controlling nature. That had likely motivated her to set ironclad protections for Carter. Loretta's documents could bolster Carter's argument that Grant had methodically undermined Valerie's wishes for years. On the day of the second court hearing, the tension was palpable. The judge entered, and the small gallery was packed with onlookers, many of them local residents who had heard bits and pieces of the scandal. Grant sat with his high-powered attorney, wearing a polished suit and an expression that radiated confidence. Carter, Sam by his side, looked determined. Richard presented the newly found evidence, which directly contradicted some of Grant's claims about Carter's independence. Loretta testified under oath, describing how she'd witnessed Grant forging or destroying certain documents after Valerie's death, though she admitted she lacked solid proof at the time. Still, her sincerity and the paper trail of memos seemed to sway the judge. Grant's attorney attempted to discredit Loretta, painting her as a disgruntled former employee. Yet she remained steadfast, tears in her eyes as she recounted the day Valerie died, the day she claimed Grant took control of everything with ruthless efficiency. In the midst of the testimonies, Grant's attorney unveiled a final strategy: attacking Sam's character. The attorney suggested Sam was orchestrating a scheme to extract money from the Thurman family, citing the pre-approved business loan and the paid hospital bills as evidence of her interest in Grant's fortune. Sam sat quietly, bristling, but she trusted Richard to handle the cross-examination. He did, expertly pointing out that Sam had never asked for those funds, and in fact had been manipulated at every turn. The judge frowned, showing apparent distaste for the blatant intimidation tactics. At last, Carter took the stand. His testimony was calm, direct, and heartbreaking. He explained how the engagement was not born of love or genuine intent, but of necessity in the face of Grant's threats. He described the fear of being left penniless, blacklisted, and the anguish of knowing that Sam and her mother would be targeted if he refused. He admitted his resentment for a stepfather who had never shown genuine affection, only dominance. By the time he finished, the courtroom was silent, and the judge sat back, steepling her fingers. She excused herself to review the evidence in chambers and promised a ruling later that afternoon. Everyone in Carter's corner was on edge during the 2-hour recess. They paced the courthouse hallways, hearts pounding. Grant, on the other hand, lounged on a bench, tapping at his phone. Sam overheard him mentioning an upcoming meeting with an out-of-state developer, and she wondered how he could remain so composed with so much at stake. Then, just before they were called back, Grant approached Carter one last time. "Withdraw your petition," he said quietly, "and I'll consider letting you and Sam walk away unscathed. Isn't that what you both want? Freedom from me?" Carter searched Grant's face for any sign of sincerity. "You don't want us free," he answered. "You just want to hold the threat of ruin over our heads." Grant shrugged. "The world's a cruel place, son. Sometimes you must do distasteful things to maintain order." If you think a piece of paper from a judge will protect you, you're more naive than I imagined. But Carter stood firm. We'll find a way to live without your money, your influence, and your blackmail. Grant's gaze hardened. Fool. Then the bailiff called them back into the courtroom. When everyone was seated, the judge delivered her decision. She acknowledged the complexity of the case, the conflicting testimonies, and the high stakes. Ultimately, she granted Carter a permanent injunction, protecting him from being compelled to sign any marriage-related documents or prenuptial agreements that might compromise his inheritance. She cited evidence of undue influence, praising Loretta's testimony as pivotal. Further, she declared that Carter was within his rights to challenge any modifications Grant had made to the trust, effectively freezing significant assets until an independent trustee could be appointed. In layman's terms, Grant was forbidden from manipulating Carter into the forced engagement or interfering with the trust. If he defied the order, he would face substantial legal penalties and possible criminal investigation. In that moment, Sam felt a wave of relief so intense it brought tears to her eyes. Carter's grip on her hand tightened, and she could see gratitude and disbelief mirrored in his features. The entire ordeal, which had started when the millionaire forced his stepson to get engaged to a waitress to humiliate him, was unraveling at last. Grant stood, his face a mask of barely contained rage. He stormed out of the courtroom without waiting to hear the final instructions from the judge. In the days that followed, the tension in Willow Creek eased. The scandal was still on everyone's lips, but the immediate threat was gone. Sam quietly returned to work at the Rustic Oak Diner, this time without the ominous possibility of being shut down looming over her. A new landlord, not connected to Thurmond, was in negotiations to purchase the building. Carter, now living temporarily with Daniel's family, contemplated transferring to a college in another state, free to choose his own path for the first time in years. Grant's influence over the local government and businesses weakened as news circulated that he was under investigation for possible criminal conduct in forging estate documents. While still wealthy, he found his reputation battered, his future uncertain. The day before Carter packed up to leave Willow Creek, he visited Sam at the diner. The late afternoon sun streamed through the windows, catching the dust motes in the air. He took a seat at the booth where he used to brood over coffee. Sam approached, wearing the same uniform but a much lighter expression. "What can I get you?" she asked with a teasing smile. He smiled back, genuine warmth in his eyes. "It's funny. Now that I don't have to hide here, I might actually enjoy a good meal for once." Then he added softly, "I'm sorry about everything you went through because of my family." She slid into the seat across from him, ignoring the curious glance of a co-worker. "It wasn't your fault," she said. "We both got pulled into something ugly, but we got out of it." He reached across the table and took her hand. "I don't know where I'm headed, but I want to help you with that bakery dream you told me about. I have resources now, or at least I will when all this legal stuff settles. I'd like to see you thrive." Sam squeezed his fingers lightly. "Thank you. I appreciate the offer. And who knows, maybe we'll cross paths again when we've both had a chance to heal from all this." Their gazes locked, lingering for a moment that spoke of gratitude, shared pain, and a tentative hope for the future. Then Sam stood and grabbed her order pad, slipping back into the role of waitress, though she no longer felt overshadowed by that label. Carter, for his part, let out a deep breath, feeling a sense of closure. There was no need for a dramatic kiss or a promise of undying love. Their bond was something forged in adversity, and whether it blossomed into romance or simply remained a profound friendship, it was authentic in a way that nothing orchestrated by Grant Thurmond could ever be. Outside, as the sun set behind Willow Creek's skyline, the last vestiges of the forced engagement scandal dissipated. Grant, watching from the gated windows of his now lonely mansion, might have harbored thoughts of vengeance or ways to reclaim his lost power. Yet the hold he had once wielded was no longer unassailable. Carter, newly unshackled, was free to decide his own future, and Sam, though bruised by the ordeal, had discovered a resilience she hadn't known she possessed. The words, "Millionaire," forced his Stepson to get engaged to a waitress to humiliate him, would continue to be whispered as a cautionary tale in Willow Creek's gossip circle. But in the end, the real lesson was not about humiliation or power. It was about the hard-won freedom that comes from exposing the truth and the possibilities that open up once you refuse to be controlled by fear. Even months later, when passers-by glimpsed Sam experimenting with pastry recipes in the small bakery she finally managed to rent, thanks in part to a modest loan co-signed by Daniel Pierce's father, they would remember how she had held her own against one of the most formidable men in town. And whenever Carter sent postcards or emails from wherever his travels took him, Sam would smile, recalling the relief and genuine affection they had found during their darkest hours. If a future lay ahead where they might share more than memories, they would face it on equal footing, free from manipulative strings. No matter what, the days of forced engagements and intimidation were over, replaced by a slow but certain healing. And that was the real triumph.